In this video, we will discuss ancient religious traditions. Ancient Mesopotamia was the home to many ancient empires and civilizations. It's important to look at Mesopotamia because we see a lot of the beginnings of religious traditions in this area. Mesopotamia literally means in the middle or in between the rivers. Today, Mesopotamia is mostly located in modern-day Iraq. In ancient Mesopotamia, we see civilizations like Sumer, which was located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, Babylon, which was located, as you can see, towards the middle, Assyria, which controlled a huge amount of land towards the top of Mesopotamia, and Akkad, which was located near Babylon. Mesopotamia is an important civilization, a group of civilizations for really any study in the humanities, and sciences as well. The Sumerians are typically credited with the invention of writing, and we see major empires and civilizations pop up here before anywhere else in the world. We see a change from agricultural civilizations that were based on simply harvesting food and using that to a transition where money and currency was valued. Because these civilizations were so huge, religion became an essential part of the civilizations. In the middle of the cities was typically a temple. According to L. de Bloy and R. J. van der Spek, quote, "It was the requirements of this temple economy that led to the invention of writing sometime between 3400 and 3200 BCE. De Bloy and van der Spek note that the Sumerians' invention of writing, at least in the way that we understand writing today, was because of the influence of the temple culture. Now, while Sumerians formed much of the basis for Mesopotamian culture, the Akkadians added on, but changed some deities' names to their own language. Later Babylonians did the same, and so on. So let's take a look at Mesopotamian religion. Now, as I noted, we have these various empires residing within Mesopotamia, and there were many more empires, such as the Hittites, which were further north of Assyria, the Elamites, who were further south, and other empires nearby. But our focus is primarily on these major four. And because they're different civilizations, they interpreted the religion slightly differently, but for the most part, their religious beliefs were very similar. We have some shared deities among the Sumerians, Babylonians, and so on, but with different names. And sometimes the chief or major deity would be different. Now, as you notice, we talk about multiple deities. Mesopotamian religion was what we call polytheistic. Polytheistic literally means many gods. Mesopotamian religion in some areas had an emphasis on one god who was a chief deity over the other. But the Mesopotamians believed that there were more than just one god, there were multitudes. For example, we see An or Anu, who's depicted as the highest or chief god in most Mesopotamian traditions. We also see Enlil, also called Elil, who is a weather god, and he often becomes the one who's most highly worshipped, even though he's not the highest god. We see Enki, or Ea, who's the god of wisdom and magic. He becomes the father of Marduk, who you'll see in the Enuma Elish. We also see a goddess, Inanna, also called Ishtar, who's the goddess of love and war. What's important to note about the deities we see here is that they're anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphic means having human-like characteristics or doing human-like actions, by something that's not human. This could be something as simple as an Aesop's fable, where we see a fox talking and fishing and doing human-like things that a fox would not actually do. So this can be true of animals or inanimate objects, but anthropomorphic can also be applied to gods and other deities. I want to keep this term in mind as we turn our attention to other religious traditions, because we see a change in some to an idea of non-anthropomorphic gods, but in ancient religious traditions we typically see gods that have human-like characteristics and actions. One of the major pieces of sacred literature that we see coming out of Mesopotamian religion is called the Enuma Elish. It's sometimes called the Epic of Creation as well. Enuma Elish is from the Akkadian and literally means when on high, which are the first words of the epic poem. We see different versions of the Enuma Elish. In the Babylonian version, Marduk is understood as this major deity and leader of humanity. In the Assyrian version, we see Assur instead of Marduk taking this role. For the most part, however, the different copies that we have of the Enuma Elish are pretty consistent and have a very similar story. Typically what you'll read is a Babylonian version, as this seems to be the most extant. The Enuma Elish was not only piece of literature that was important to the Mesopotamians, but was actually used for the Babylonian New Year festival. Each year, this text would be read for the Babylonian New Year festival, essentially to remind the people that the king or high leader was descended from Marduk, this warrior god who helped create humanity. The Enuma Elish is a really interesting text that begins with two primordial gods, Apsu, who is a god of fresh water, and Tiamat, who is a god of salt water. These two gods are given genders, Apsu is male and Tiamat is female, and they're said to essentially combine their waters. So we have a mixture of fresh water with Apsu and Tiamat for the salt water. In the ancient world, salt water was typically understood as something chaotic. You can think of major bodies of salt water like oceans, and how we see hurricanes and typhoons and tsunamis and other horrible events happening in those. So it's no wonder that ancient peoples would have associated salt water with chaos. So we see this beginning where there's two primordial gods or embodiments of two different types of water. And there's chaos out there. In the story of the Enuma Elish, after Apsu and Tiamat combine their waters, they create other gods. And eventually Apsu gets irritated with all the clamor that the other gods are making. So he decides that they should kill the children that they've created. But Tiamat is not okay with this. However, some of the other gods rise up and end up killing Apsu. And Tiamat is angry and decides that she will go ahead and kill essentially her children to avenge her partner's death. However, we see in the story the triumph of Marduk, who is this warrior god and is very human-like and seen as the ancestor of the kingship on Earth, which is why this tale becomes so important to Mesopotamian leaders. Marduk leads armies to slay Tiamat and ends up using her body after he kills her to create the universe. Later we see Marduk's father, Ea, following Marduk's command and creating humanity from Kingu, who is one of Tiamat's advisors. And after killing Kingu, he combines Kingu's blood with clay to create humanity. And Marduk asks for this, not simply for the desire to create, but so that there can be humans to be slaves to the gods. What we see in this story is two different things. The first is what we call cosmogony. A cosmogony is literally the beginning of the world or universe. So a cosmogony is a myth that is a traditional story about the beginning of the universe, world, and typically has something to do with gods and or goddesses and the history of a culture. We also see what we call a theogony. We'll come back to this term when we talk about Greek civilizations as well. Theogony, as you can see, is very similar, but we have this beginning theo, which means god or gods. A theogony is the creation of gods and or goddesses, and typically is a myth and a traditional story, just like a cosmogony. We see both of these come into play in the Enuma Elish, with the gods being created at the beginning of the story, and Marduk creating the universe, or the world, which is a cosmogony, later in the story. If we move from Mesopotamia to the southwest just a bit, we find the ancient Egyptian civilization. In ancient Egypt, religion truly was a way of life that pervaded all things. We see again a polytheistic culture with a belief in many gods, but it differs a bit from what we see in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the gods typically were chaotic. We see with Tiamat, who is the saltwater god, and we see with Marduk slaying Tiamat, that the world begins with chaos. The gods seem to put their own desires and even inflict slavery onto humanity. However, in ancient Egypt, while the Egyptians were polytheistic, they saw rather than abstract gods, that certain aspects of life, science, and so on were embodied by the gods. For example, we see Ra, who's the sun god. We see agricultural gods. We see gods who are wind gods, storm gods, animal gods, and so on. What was important to the ancient Egyptians was keeping balance or harmony in life. This was important during life as well as in preparation for the afterlife and judgment by Osiris, the god of death. In the Egyptian tradition, this is called Ma'at, this idea of balance or harmony. The afterlife in Egyptian religion was quite a bit different from Mesopotamian. In Mesopotamian religion, we really don't have a strong emphasis on the afterlife. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you'll notice that Gilgamesh is on a quest for immortality, because there's no afterlife, there's nothing to look forward to. The Egyptians, however, focused very strongly on an afterlife, and noted that it would be as enjoyable as possible as long as the body was preserved, and as long as during life the human essentially lived a good, balanced, and harmonious life. While in Mesopotamian religion we see that the kings inherit some kind of power from Marduk, in the Egyptian religion we see that the pharaohs essentially take on godlike qualities on earth. They essentially act as mediators between the gods and goddesses, who are celestial or aspects of the world and universe and life, between those gods and goddesses and between the humans. You might notice that a lot of pharaohs would take on deities' names as part of their own. For example, Akhenaten takes on the name Aten as part of his name, even though his name was not Akhenaten to begin with. One thing that we might note with this pharaoh, for example, is that some Egyptian periods are seen as monotheistic, which means one god. During Akhenaten's reign, we see this emphasis on one god, Aten, rather than on the multitude of gods who encompass the aspects of life. So we can see Egyptian religion changing throughout some of the pharaohs' lives and roles. While we can find many texts from ancient Egypt that are important for our understanding of Egyptian religion, one place we can look is the pyramid texts. As you can see here, the pyramid texts were carvings inside pyramid walls, or sometimes sarcophagi. These date back to Old Kingdom Egypt, so around the 2600s to 2100s BCE. They appear to be funerary texts, important for guiding the soul to the afterlife. As you read a selection from the pyramid text, you'll notice a few different deities and concepts that might be unfamiliar. The first of these is Nun. As we saw with the Enuma Elish, this idea of a watery chaos before creation, we see the same idea in ancient Egyptian religion. Nun is some kind of watery abyss and is personified as a deity, kind of like Tiamat-Napsu. However, Nun seems to encompass both the chaotic saltwater and the calm freshwater. So we don't see this emphasis on chaos as much as we do in the Mesopotamian traditions. We also see a deity Sia, who is a wisdom deity and is wisdom personified. An Akh, which is also wisdom personified, but this becomes essentially the intellect or wisdom of a human that's personified, rather than a deity. And finally, we see Ma'at. Now, if you remember when we talked about the Egyptian desire for harmony and balance, we used the word Ma'at there. Ma'at was used to talk about simply the idea of harmony and balance and order, but Ma'at was also an anthropomorphic personified goddess who encompassed these ideas of order, of harmony, of truth, of balance. As we turn to Greek religion, it's important to note that the Greeks were polytheistic, much like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. They had a multitude of gods, and their religion and their gods were central to their cultural identity. We see Homer's stories, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, acting somewhat as records of these Greek religions' ideas, because the religions were simply oral traditions. The Greeks did not have sacred texts like some other religions' traditions did. We see, much like the Mesopotamians, that the gods and goddesses in Greek traditions were anthropomorphic, to the point of even interacting with humans, having affairs with humans, and having affairs with other gods. We see, for example, Zeus, the god of thunder, who's typically understood as the chief deity in Greek traditions. Hera, his wife, who is the goddess of marriage. And while we might think that the gods and goddesses have very serious roles, like Athena, the goddess of wisdom, or Zeus, the god of thunder, we also see Dionysus, who's the god of wine and revelry. And as an example of this anthropomorphism of the gods to a very major extent, we see Zeus having an affair with a human woman to produce a son, Heracles, who takes on both aspects of humans and aspects of gods as a half-god, half-human. And we see some of these stories in Hesiod's Theogony. Hesiod's Theogony discusses the origins of the gods, beginning with the creation of the world. Again, we see this word theogony, which means creation of gods. And we see these stories of how gods like Zeus were created, Zeus's offspring, and Zeus's ancestors as well. As I noted, Greek religion was essential to the cultural identity of the Greeks. Different cities had patron deities, which meant that these deities were worshipped alongside other gods in the pantheon, but that certain deities were understood as kind of like the guardian of a certain city. For example, you can see a picture of the Parthenon here in Athens, Greece. Athens comes from the name Athena, who is the goddess of wisdom. And Athena was the patron deity for Athens, so she was understood as the one who would watch over that city more than the other gods would. Now, while early forms of Greek religion did not really have a concept of life after death, later ideas had a concept of a body-soul split, and these ideas ended up influencing other religious traditions, such as Christianity. And we see this come about with the adaptation of Greek religious beliefs. We see this change both as the Greeks interacted more with other cultures, as well as simply with the rise of philosophy and science. During the classical period, we see that major philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and scientific ideas essentially cast doubt on certain religious beliefs. Religion was still important, and many individuals had some sort of faith in the gods. But other individuals recognized that this religion was important as a culture and less as an individual religion for groups to meet around. We see that the Greeks ended up adopting and adapting certain Mesopotamian and Egyptian gods and ideas. For example, we see foreign deities make their way into Greek religion. One of these examples is the Egyptian goddess Isis, who was originally only an Egyptian goddess, and then becomes a Greek goddess, though changed a bit. We also see the change of certain goddesses. For example, Ishtar, who we see in the Mesopotamian tradition as the goddess of love, is merged with Aphrodite, who is the goddess of love in Greek religion. When we talk about Roman religion, we really aren't changing the ideas from the Greek religion significantly. In fact, you might hear the term Greco-Roman to refer to both cultures simultaneously, as the religious ideas were very similar. The Romans were polytheistic just like the Greeks and Mesopotamians and Egyptians. However, there was this emphasis on emperor worship. Now, we do see this in the Greeks' religion, particularly in the Hellenistic period, with the idea of worshiping kings. If you've read the story of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, you can remember when Nebuchadnezzar II asks the Jews to worship him. So we see this idea beginning with the Greeks, but we see it fleshed out even more with the Romans. The emperors were not necessarily mediators between the gods and humanity, but were actually gods on earth to be worshipped. In Roman religion, we see a focus on myths, and we see these in Greek religion, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian traditions as well, but we see particularly a focus on myths versus dogmas. Now, we need to take a moment to define the word myth. Typically, the word myth is thought of as something false or not true, but when we talk about myth in terms of religion and literature, we are not saying anything about the veracity or truthfulness of the story. Our concern is not with whether the story is true or false, or whether people even believe the story is true or false. But a myth in this case is a traditional story about a past event that usually involves gods and or goddesses, and is often tied to the history of a nation. Du Bois and Van der Spek note about this change between myths and dogmas for Roman religion that, quote, the myths were not generally held to be true, so it did not matter that they did not agree with one another. The idea here that we see is that the Romans had very similar myths to the Greeks. They had these stories of the different gods who maybe had affairs with other gods, with humans, and so on. And even though the myths overlapped, or were very elaborate, so if you think of the founding of Rome story with Romulus and Remus, these stories were not necessarily intended or taken as true. They were simply traditional stories that were culturally significant for the Roman people. Now, at first, Roman gods were not depicted, but as Greek religion influenced Roman religion, there was a change in this. So the gods became more anthropomorphic later, as Greek gods were merged with Roman. We see some of these stories in Ovid's Metamorphoses. This tells the tale of creation all the way through Julius Caesar's reign. Some of the gods that we see are Zeus, who we see as the chief god of thunder in Roman religion, is merged with Jupiter in Roman religion. We see Hera merged with Juno in the Roman tradition. And we see Isis, who became Aphrodite in the Greek tradition, becomes Venus in this tradition. We also see an importance of augury. The Romans thought that as long as they kept some kind of peace with the gods, which we call pax deorum, means peace with the gods, and they made sacrifices to appease the gods, that the gods would not harm them and would protect them. And one way to tell what would happen was through augury, which was interpreting signs and omens. If you read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you'll see the importance of augury in that tale to Roman religion. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to define the following terms: cosmogony, theogony, monotheistic, polytheistic, myth, and anthropomorphic. Describe Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman religions and some of their myths. And explain the connection between these traditions and how their myths affect their worldviews.